Welcome, my name is Geurts.
And my name is Alonso Ayala.
In this presentation, the two of us will talk about the 5A approach for adequate housing. The 5 A's refer to a set of 5 principles that we propose to use for the design, implementation, or evaluation of a housing policy to achieve adequate housing. The 5A approach is not the answer to the housing challenge, but rather a contribution to solve it. The right to adequate housing is part of international human rights law since 1948 and adopts a formal legal definition of adequate housing. Based on our work, we have sought to find a more practical definition for adequate housing, which is translated into a set of principles to guide housing policies. These principles are at the core of the 5A approach. The global housing crisis, both in the global north and south, has been coined the housing affordability crisis. The issue is that housing is too expensive, while incomes are too low. Taking the lens of housing justice, it becomes clear that safety is a key part of the adequate housing challenge, as its impacts can vary, from unsafe structures to precarious locations to the absence of security of tenure. You can see that there is a big difference between the housing morphology of the left and the right. A process of spatial segregation seems to be going on as reflected by the housing conditions. This is what we call housing injustice, and because housing usually represents 70% of all land use in cities, therefore it has a large impact on the way cities are socially and spatially constructed. In the following slides, Alonso will introduce you the 5A principles.
The first A principle of adequate housing is availability. Availability refers to the number of housing units which are newly built or existing. This principle considers the location of these houses as determinant of its adequacy. So what we are saying here is that this housing stock needs to be available in the right locations. The supplies of service land and houses in combination with housing finance is also part of the concept of availability. This refers to having a clear understanding of housing needs, which is crucial to achieve adequate housing. Housing needs refer to the relationship between housing demand and supply. Once we understand the needs of the demand side, the supply side can be enabled to provide housing. It is very important to understand that housing supply must be the result of housing demand. But for availability to work, it also needs to be accessible. So let's look into accessibility. Accessibility refers to the double access condition of physical and financial access. It is the access that a household has to land, housing, and urban infrastructure. Another aspect of accessibility, which is important to consider, relates to the eligibility criteria and allocation modalities. This refers to priority setting, target groups, specific needs groups, demand-driven models, and other modalities. Accessibility also includes access to information. For example, information on the eligibility criteria for available financial resources and general information needed to understand the housing market and the possibilities to access it. The third principle is affordability. Affordability has been defined in several ways, but the most used one refers to the proportion of the household income which is spent on housing-related costs. The so-called affordability threshold, which is a rule of thumb, stipulates that a household should not spend more than 25 to 30% of their total monthly income on housing-related costs. Affordability relates also to housing tenure, as there is a difference between affording rental accommodation and affording to buy a house. There could be different financial models or instruments which are available and accessible for people to afford homes either on the rental or the ownership market. This also relates to the process of how people can afford a house. For example, incrementally through the years with one's own equity or through a mortgage. A fundamental issue that comes with the affordability aspect is the quality of the affordable unit and the difficulty of defining minimum quality standards. In general, higher standards translate into higher housing costs. For example, square meters available per person. So what we see, in particular in the Global South, is that the only way to lower the cost of housing is by lowering the standards, and therefore, quality and costs are always in conflict. The fourth A principle of adequate housing is acceptability. It relates to the quality of housing outcomes. Acceptability also refers to real housing needs because it considers the changing needs of a household over time. For example, spatial needs are different for young couples, elderly people, and young professionals who jointly form a household. It is also related to the cultural adequacy the housing solutions provides. In the end, housing outcomes should be the expression of cultural identity. Many large-scale housing programs do not match the real needs of its occupants. What you often find in these situations is that over time, the housing transforms into something that reflects both the cultural identity of the inhabitants as well as the spatial needs that relate to their life cycles. The last principle of adequate housing is adaptability. Adaptability is about how housing design and technology can allow for an incremental housing approach which adapts to the dynamic needs of a household. Adaptability also refers to the impact of housing on the environment. In order to be responsive to the challenges of climate change, housing therefore needs to be adaptive.
In conclusion, affordability is a challenge that is affecting a very wide range of households from around the world. Affordable housing is often synonymous for housing of low-income dwellers. However, increasingly, we see that the affordable housing challenge is also affecting large parts of what we call the gap or middle-income household segment. It's a fine balancing act to make informed choices about which segments of the housing market need intervention, and one of the key choices in policy making is often finding the balance between quantity and quality. Most cities and countries in the world that actively intervene in the housing sector go through cycles of focusing on the numbers of housing production, followed by a period where the focus lies more on the quality of housing. This balancing act ties into the issue of availability and also accessibility. This influences decisions on what to develop, where to develop, and for whom. The desired outcomes differ and are very location-specific, and therefore require acceptability. As housing is realized over time and also directly impacts our future impact on the environment, the last principle is about adaptability. So here we are. We present to you the 5 principles of affordability, accessibility, availability, acceptability, and adaptability, which, as a collective set of principles, help in understanding and evaluating the housing challenge from a policymaking and implementation perspective. The intention is that this combined set of principles provides both a practical approach and an evaluation tool to realize adequate housing in the context of achieving housing justice.